If you think rich families hide their secrets behind silver candles and Thanksgiving prayers, wait until you hear what happened inside the Bennett mansion that night. The crystal wine glass shattered against the marble floor a full second before Claire Bennett collapsed beside the Thanksgiving table, and for one frozen moment nobody moved, not the housekeeper standing near the fireplace, not the guests holding half-finished champagne flutes, not even Margaret Bennett, whose perfectly manicured fingers still rested beside the carved turkey at the center of the 20-foot dining table. The mansion fell silent, except for the soft piano music drifting through hidden speakers and the distant crackling of the fireplace. Claire pressed one trembling hand against her 8-month pregnant belly while dark red wine spread across the white tablecloth like spilled ink. Her breathing slowed, her vision blurred at the edges, and somewhere beyond the ringing in her ears she heard Margaret's voice slice through the room with practiced panic. "Oh my God, somebody call 911! But Claire already knew something nobody else at that table understood. The poison tasted familiar. The scent hit first, bitter almond berry beneath expensive Napa Valley Cabernet, subtle enough that most people would never notice it. But Claire Bennett was not most people. 3 years earlier she had spent 11 straight months inside a federal behavioral analysis program learning how killers lied, how wealthy people concealed crimes, and how toxins left traces in the body before symptoms ever appeared. Her instructors used to say one sentence over and over: if a predator thinks you are weak, they stop hiding their teeth. Claire's cheek pressed against the cold marble floor as polished dress shoes rushed around her. Above her the enormous chandelier blurred into soft, golden circles while voices overlapped in artificial concern. Ethan Bennett finally pushed back his chair so hard it scraped across the hardwood floor. "Claire, baby, stay with me," he said, dropping beside her, but his voice carried something strange, not fear, not shock, calculation. Claire noticed everything, even now: the slight tremor in his jaw, the sweat forming near his temple, the way his eyes flicked once toward his mother before returning to her face. Margaret stood slowly from the head of the table, draped in pearls and dark emerald silk, every inch the perfect southern socialite, her silver hair immaculate, her expression carefully devastated. "She was perfectly fine 5 minutes ago," Margaret whispered while guests exchanged nervous looks around the room. "Maybe it's the pregnancy stress." Claire almost laughed at that, because 3 months earlier someone had tampered with her prenatal vitamins, and 2 weeks after that the brakes on her Range Rover failed halfway down a private road near the estate. At the time, Ethan called it bad luck. Claire called it a pattern. Another sharp wave rolled through her stomach, and this time the baby kicked hard beneath her hand, strong enough to pull her briefly back into focus. She heard footsteps approaching rapidly. Security staff, probably, maybe paramedics, maybe both. But before anyone could reach her, Claire forced her eyes open and looked directly at Margaret Bennett. Across the room, thunder rattled the tall mansion windows while candlelight flickered against portraits of dead Bennett men staring down from oil paintings like silent judges. Margaret's face remained composed, almost too composed, but Claire caught it anyway. The tiny movement around her mouth, the micro-expression lasting less than half a second. Relief, not panic, relief. And in that exact moment Claire Bennett realized Thanksgiving dinner had never been a family celebration. It had been a test to see whether the pregnant wife survived the night. The ambulance sirens echoed through the circular driveway of the Bennett estate exactly 4 minutes later, but by then Claire Bennett had already memorized every face around the dining table. Ethan stayed beside her on the marble floor, gripping her hand tightly enough to look convincing, while guests whispered in frightened voices beneath the warm glow of antique chandeliers. Somebody near the fireplace began quietly crying, and one of Margaret Bennett's country club friends kept repeating the same sentence over and over. "This cannot be happening on Thanksgiving." Claire slowed her breathing, deliberately forcing her pulse lower, while the metallic taste lingered at the back of her throat. Above her, the enormous grandfather clock near the staircase ticked steadily, each second sounding louder than the last. Then she heard it, the sentence that changed everything. "We should keep this private until we know what happened." Margaret spoke softly, but Claire caught the sharpness beneath the concern. That was not the response of a terrified mother-in-law, it was the response of someone protecting a reputation. Claire let her eyelids remain half-closed while paramedics entered the mansion carrying equipment bags across imported Persian rugs. The younger paramedic knelt immediately beside her. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Claire gave a weak nod while his partner checked her blood pressure. Ethan rubbed her shoulder carefully, performing the role of worried husband with almost perfect precision, almost because Claire noticed the detail nobody else did. Ethan never once asked what she drank, he already knew. "Her pulse is unstable," the paramedic said quietly. "We need to move now." Margaret stepped forward immediately, pearls glimmering beneath the dining room lights. "Please do whatever you have to do for my grandchild," she whispered, and for a moment the entire room seemed to soften at the sight of the elegant older woman fighting back tears. Guests exchanged sympathetic looks. Someone even touched Margaret's arm comfortingly, but Claire saw through it all because she had spent years studying deception inside windowless federal training rooms where instructors replayed interrogation footage frame by frame, teaching agents how evil learned to smile. Her mentor used to say wealthy people rarely panic during a crime, they panic when control disappears. Another cramp twisted through Claire's stomach, sharper this time, and genuine fear finally pierced through her concentration. The baby kicked once, then went strangely still. Cold dread crawled up her spine beneath the thin silk fabric of her maternity dress. No matter how prepared she thought she was, this part had become real. The poison was no longer theoretical. A paramedic adjusted the oxygen mask against her face while Ethan leaned closer. "You are going to be okay, Claire," he whispered, but his wedding ring tapped nervously against the marble floor, and Claire remembered another moment 3 weeks earlier. Ethan standing in the nursery at 2 in the morning pretending to search for paperwork, while secretly deleting security footage from the hallway camera. She had noticed then too. She always noticed the stretcher wheels rattled softly across the hardwood floor as paramedics prepared to lift her, and that was when Claire saw it near Margaret's untouched wine glass resting beside the silver candle holder, a tiny white residue along the rim, almost invisible unless someone knew exactly what to look for. Cyanogenic compounds, sometimes crystallized when mixed improperly, especially in acidic red wine. Claire felt a chill unrelated to the poison because suddenly everything connected: the altered vitamins, the brake failure, the disconnected nursery cameras. None of it had been random. Someone at this table had been trying to remove her for months, and tonight they believed they had finally succeeded. As paramedics lifted her toward the stretcher, Claire turned her head slightly toward Margaret. Their eyes met across the glowing Thanksgiving dining room, and for one brief, terrifying second the older woman stopped pretending. The grief vanished, the concern disappeared, and behind the polished smile of a Southern millionaire matriarch, Claire Bennett saw pure satisfaction. Rain hammered against the ambulance windows as red and blue lights flashed across the dark streets of Savannah, and Claire Bennett lay perfectly still beneath a heated blanket, while the paramedic monitored her heartbeat every 30 seconds. The oxygen mask covered most of her face, but her mind remained painfully clear. She counted everything: the speed of the vehicle, the rhythm of the windshield wipers, the tension in Ethan's breathing beside her. He had insisted on riding with her to the hospital, and now sat near the rear doors, gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles had turned pale. Claire noticed he had not called his mother once, not once. That detail mattered. "The baby's heartbeat is stable for now," the paramedic said, adjusting a monitor beside her. "But we need toxicology immediately." Ethan looked up too quickly. "Toxicology," he repeated, and there it was again, that tiny fracture in his composure. Claire almost pitied him because fear always revealed itself eventually, even inside men raised behind country club smiles and billion-dollar trust funds. Outside the ambulance windows, downtown Savannah blurred past in streaks of gold and rainwater, while Claire drifted backward through memory. 4 years earlier she had stood inside a gray federal training facility in Quantico, Virginia, wearing running shoes and a Navy Academy sweatshirt, while Special Agent Daniel Hayes circled a classroom full of recruits. "Most people think criminals look dangerous," he had said calmly, "but the smartest predators look comforting." 20 agents sat silently taking notes, while surveillance footage flickered across the screen behind him. Husbands poisoning spouses, business partners destroying each other, families quietly collapsing behind luxury walls. Claire remembered the exact moment Daniel stopped beside her desk and asked one question. "What is the first mistake victims make?" Claire answered immediately. "They assume love guarantees safety." Daniel smiled slightly. "Correct. The ambulance hit a pothole hard enough to jolt Claire back into the present." Another cramp twisted low in her abdomen, and this time she could not completely hide the pain. A soft alarm beeped beside the monitor. "Easy, ma'am," the paramedic said quietly. "Try to stay calm for the baby." Calm. Claire almost laughed at the word, because calm was the first skill they trained out of fear inside federal behavioral analysis programs. She remembered sleepless nights inside observation rooms studying body language until dawn, learning how narcissists manipulated guilt, how wealthy families buried scandals, how criminals rehearsed sympathy. In mirrors before speaking to police, Claire had once been one of the best deception specialists in her division before she disappeared from that life entirely, before Ethan Bennett, before marriage, before the massive white-columned mansion where every hallway smelled faintly of money and secrets. Ethan leaned closer beside her stretcher. "Claire, look at me," he whispered softly. "You scared everybody tonight." "Everybody, not me." Claire turned her head slightly toward him, and for the first time since collapsing, she spoke clearly through the oxygen mask. "What exactly did your mother put in the wine?" Silence swallowed the ambulance. The paramedic glanced upward briefly from his equipment. While rain pounded harder against the roof, Ethan froze completely. His face lost color so quickly it almost frightened her. "Claire, you are confused," he said finally, but his voice cracked halfway through the sentence. "Confused? Another mistake. Liars always explain too much. Truthful people usually ask questions." First, Claire watched his throat tighten as he looked away toward the rain-covered windows, and suddenly she understood something far worse than poisoning. Ethan Bennett had expected her to die tonight. The realization settled over her like cold water, because this was no longer suspicion or paranoia, it was confirmation. Another sharp kick pressed against her ribs, and Claire closed her eyes briefly, one hand protecting the curve of her stomach. Beneath the blanket, somewhere deep beneath the fear, another emotion began rising, slowly, controlled and dangerous. She had not survived federal training by accident, and if the Bennett family truly believed the pregnant wife in the back of that ambulance was helpless, then they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Memorial St. Catherine Hospital smelled like antiseptic coffee and cold rainwater when the ambulance doors burst open at 9:47 p.m. Nurses rushed beside Claire Bennett's stretcher beneath harsh fluorescent lights, while polished tile floors reflected the flashing emergency lights outside through half-open eyes. Claire watched the controlled chaos around her. Doctors calling out vitals, nurses attaching monitors, elevator doors sliding open and shut like mechanical jaws. Somewhere nearby a child cried in another wing of the hospital, and overhead a television quietly played Thanksgiving football highlights, as if the world had not just tilted sideways. Claire's stretcher rolled through double doors into a private emergency suite reserved for high-profile patients, because the Bennett family donated enough money each year to have their name engraved on half the hospital walls. Ethan stayed close beside her, but his silence had changed. Inside the ambulance he had been nervous. Now he looked trapped. A nurse adjusted Claire's oxygen, while another placed an identification bracelet around her wrist. 8 months pregnant, possible toxin exposure, someone said near the foot of the bed. "We need obstetrics and toxicology immediately." Ethan stepped forward quickly. "Can we keep this discreet?" he asked, and Claire almost smiled again. There it was, reputation before survival, classic Bennett family behavior. She remembered Margaret once saying during a charity gala, "People can recover from tragedy, but they never recover from embarrassment." At the time, Claire thought it sounded cold. Tonight it sounded like a confession. A young doctor entered the room moments later, introducing herself as Dr. Lisa Monroe. She was calm, efficient, maybe early 30s, with tired eyes that suggested she had already worked too many holiday shifts. "Mrs. Bennett, I need you to stay awake for me," she said gently while checking Claire's pupils. "Do you remember what you consumed tonight?" Claire answered carefully. "Red wine, cranberry reduction sauce, and almond tart." Ethan's head turned sharply toward her at the word almond. Too fast, too defensive. Dr. Monroe noticed it too. Claire could tell by the tiny shift in the doctor's expression. Trained people recognized reactions. "Has she had allergies during the pregnancy?" the doctor asked. Ethan opened his mouth, but Claire interrupted softly. "No allergies." Then after a pause she added, "But someone has been trying to make me sick for months." Silence dropped heavily across the room. Ethan stared at her like she had detonated a bomb beneath the hospital bed. "Claire, do not start this again," he whispered harshly, but the damage was already done. Dr. Monroe slowly removed her gloves. "Again," she repeated. Claire looked directly at the doctor, now fully alert despite the exhaustion burning through her body. "3 months ago my prenatal vitamins were tampered with," she said quietly. 2 weeks later my brakes failed on a private road outside Savannah. Last week our nursery cameras disconnected for exactly 18 minutes. Ethan ran one hand through his hair, breathing harder now. "These were accidents," he insisted, but Claire noticed sweat forming near his collar despite the cold hospital air. The monitors beside her bed beeped steadily, each sound cutting through the growing tension. Then Claire saw Something unexpected through the small glass window in the emergency room door. A man in a dark overcoat had just entered the hallway, tall, broad-shouldered, silver at the temples, standing perfectly still, while rainwater dripped from the edge of his coat. Claire's heartbeat changed instantly because even after 4 years she recognized him. Special Agent Daniel Hayes did not move toward the room immediately. He simply watched through the glass with the same unreadable expression he used during interrogations back in Quantico. Ethan followed Claire's gaze toward the hallway, and all the color disappeared from his face. In that exact moment, Claire understood two terrifying things at once. First, someone inside the Bennett family had truly expected her to die tonight, and second, Ethan Bennett knew exactly who Daniel Hayes was, which meant her husband had not only hidden secrets from her, he had been hiding fear. The hallway outside the emergency suite felt unnaturally quiet after Daniel Hayes appeared behind the glass door. Rainwater still darkened the shoulders of his charcoal overcoat, while nurses moved quickly around him carrying clipboards and medication trays, but nobody seemed to notice the tension that entered the room with him. Claire Bennett had seen that expression before, the unreadable stillness, the controlled posture, the kind of calm that only existed in people trained to walk into dangerous situations without blinking. Ethan noticed it too because his breathing changed immediately, shallow, uneven, nervous. Daniel stepped inside without rushing, removing a pair of black leather gloves slowly as fluorescent lights reflected against the polished hospital floor. "Claire," he said quietly, and hearing her name in his voice after 4 years almost broke something inside her because it reminded her of who she used to be before marriage, before Savannah, before pretending softness meant safety. Dr. Monroe glanced between them carefully. "Sir, family only," she began, but Daniel calmly reached inside his coat and handed her a federal identification card. The doctor's face shifted almost instantly. "Special Agent," she whispered. Daniel nodded once. "Former Special Agent," he corrected. "But I believe Mrs. Bennett may currently be the victim of attempted poisoning." The room turned ice cold. Ethan stood up too fast beside the hospital bed. "This is insane," he snapped. "Claire has been under stress for months, and now everybody is turning this into some conspiracy." Daniel never even looked at him. "Interesting choice of words," he said calmly. "Most innocent husbands say what happened, they do not say conspiracy." Claire watched Ethan carefully now, the same way she once studied suspects inside behavioral interview rooms. Every reaction mattered, every blink, every movement. And Ethan Bennett was unraveling. Dr. Monroe cleared her throat uneasily while monitors continued their steady electronic rhythm beside the bed. "Toxicology is running expedited labs now," she explained. "But preliminary symptoms are consistent with low-dose cyanogenic exposure." Ethan's face drained completely of color. Claire felt the shift instantly because that was not the reaction of a shocked husband, it was recognition. Daniel finally turned toward him then, and the silence between the two men felt heavier than anything spoken. "You remember your wife's former work now, do you not, Ethan?" Daniel asked quietly. Ethan swallowed hard. "Claire told me she worked in consulting." Daniel almost smiled at that. "No," he said softly. "She told you what we trained her to say." A nurse entered carrying a sealed evidence bag containing the remnants of Claire's wine glass from the mansion, and Daniel's eyes followed it immediately. "Good," he murmured. "Chain of custody started early." Ethan stepped backwards slightly, and Claire noticed his hand moving instinctively toward his phone before stopping halfway. "Another mistake. Guilty people always wanted communication control." Daniel approached the hospital bed carefully, lowering his voice so only Claire could hear. "Did you activate protocol?" Claire gave the smallest nod possible beneath the blankets. Daniel exhaled slowly, almost relieved. "Then the recorder is still live." Ethan looked between them, now visibly confused, and Claire realized something important. Her husband had underestimated how much preparation federal training created because Claire Bennett had not walked blindly into the Bennett family. She had grown suspicious months ago, and once suspicion began, she never stopped observing. 3 months earlier, after the brake failure, she had secretly activated a dormant emergency protocol buried inside an encrypted watch app originally designed for undercover field agents. Every unusual incident, every disconnected camera, every altered medication bottle, every conversation had been quietly documented and transmitted to an external server. Ethan still did not know that fact, either did Margaret. Somewhere deep in the hospital, another announcement echoed over the intercom, while thunder rattled the windows overlooking Savannah Memorial Hospital. Claire slowly turned her head toward Daniel again. If the toxicology confirms it, she whispered weakly, Margaret will try to bury everything before sunrise. Daniel's expression hardened instantly. Too late, he replied. Then he reached into his coat pocket and placed a small silver flash drive onto the hospital tray beside her bed. Because 1 hour before Thanksgiving dinner started, he said quietly, your mother-in-law made a phone call she should never have made. The storm outside Savannah Memorial grew louder after midnight thunder rolling across the city while rain streaked down the hospital windows in silver lines. Claire Bennett lay propped slightly upright in the private maternity suite listening to the steady electronic rhythm of fetal monitors beside her bed. Every sound inside the room felt amplified: the soft hiss of oxygen, the squeak of nurses' shoes in the hallway, the low mechanical hum of hospital ventilation systems. But beneath all of it, another tension had settled over the room, something colder and far more dangerous. Ethan Bennett had stopped pretending entirely. 20 minutes earlier he claimed he needed coffee and stepped into the hallway, but Claire noticed he never returned. Instead, she saw him through the partially open blinds, standing near the elevators, speaking urgently into his phone, one hand pressed against the back of his neck, exactly the way he always stood when afraid. Daniel Hayes remained inside the room near the darkened window, studying the silver flash drive he had placed beside Claire's bed earlier. Dr. Monroe had already confirmed trace cyanogenic compounds in Claire's bloodstream, enough to endanger both mother and child without immediate treatment, but not enough to guarantee fatality. Whoever prepared the dosage wanted uncertainty, enough poison to create medical complications, not enough to trigger obvious suspicion. Daniel folded his arms slowly. That tells me something important, he said quietly. Claire looked toward him, exhausted but focused. Margaret wanted plausible deniability. Daniel nodded once. Exactly. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room in pale blue for half a second before darkness returned. Claire shifted carefully beneath the blankets, one protective hand resting over her stomach. What was on the phone call? She asked. Daniel stared at the rain beyond the glass for a moment before answering. Margaret contacted someone named Victor Hale 1 hour before dinner. Claire frowned faintly. The name meant nothing to her. Who is he? Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. Private crisis management consultant, he said, which is a polite term wealthy families use when they need scandals erased quietly. Claire felt cold, despite the heated blankets, because suddenly pieces of the Bennett empire began rearranging themselves in her mind. Ethan's constant secrecy, Margaret's obsession with appearances, the unexplained non-disclosure agreements employees signed after leaving the estate. Daniel inserted the flash drive into a hospital laptop beside the bed, and a grainy audio file began playing softly through the speakers. At first there was only static, then Margaret Bennett's unmistakable voice, smooth, elegant, controlled. If tonight becomes complicated, I expect immediate containment. Silence followed before a man answered calmly. And the wife? Margaret hesitated only briefly. The family legacy cannot survive her. Claire's heartbeat monitor jumped sharply beside the bed. Daniel stopped the recording immediately before the stress triggered another alarm across the hallway. Ethan suddenly appeared through the glass door again, but froze the second he saw the laptop open. Fear flashed across his face, raw, immediate. Impossible to hide. He stepped into the room slowly, rainwater still darkening the shoulders of his expensive coat. What is this? He asked quietly. Daniel closed the laptop without urgency. Evidence. Ethan looked directly at Claire then, and for the first time since the Thanksgiving dinner his voice sounded almost desperate. Claire, listen to me. My mother is difficult, but she would never hurt you. Claire studied him silently because federal training had taught her the difference between deception and denial. Ethan was not defending Margaret because he believed she was innocent. He was defending her because he knew exactly how guilty she was. Somewhere down the hallway a code blue alarm suddenly echoed through another wing of the hospital, followed by hurried footsteps and rattling equipment carts. The chaos lasted only seconds before fading again, leaving the room swallowed in silence. Ethan rubbed one shaking hand across his face, then whispered something Claire never expected to hear. You do not understand what my family is capable of. Daniel slowly straightened beside the window, his expression turning colder than Claire had ever seen. No, Ethan, he replied quietly. The problem is that now we do. By 2:15 in the morning the storm over Savannah had finally begun to weaken, but inside Memorial St. Catherine Hospital the pressure surrounding Claire Bennett only grew heavier. The maternity suite lights had been dimmed low enough for rest, yet nobody inside the room looked capable of sleeping. Claire sat upright now, wrapped in a pale gray blanket, while fetal monitors continued their steady rhythm beside her bed. Each heartbeat from her unborn son sounded stronger than before, and for the first time since Thanksgiving dinner she allowed herself one small breath of relief. The baby was stable, but the danger around them was not. Daniel Hayes stood near the doorway, quietly speaking into his phone with federal investigators while Dr. Monroe reviewed toxicology updates at the nurse's station. Outside the glass walls of the suite, Ethan Bennett had disappeared again nearly 20 minutes earlier, and Claire already knew exactly why wealthy families did not wait for consequences. They moved quickly, erased evidence, called attorneys, manipulated narratives. That was how dynasties survived. Then Claire noticed something strange reflected in the dark hospital window across from her bed. A woman wearing an expensive cream-colored coat had just stepped off the elevator at the far end of the hallway. Even from a distance Claire recognized the posture immediately. Margaret Bennett moved through the corridor with perfect composure, pearls still around her neck, hair immaculate despite the late hour, as if she were arriving for a charity gala instead of visiting the pregnant daughter-in-law who nearly died at Thanksgiving dinner. 2 private attorneys followed behind her carrying leather briefcases. Claire's stomach tightened because she understood the message instantly. Margaret was not here as family, she was here to regain control. Dr. Monroe intercepted her outside the room. "Mrs. Bennett, visiting hours are restricted right now." Margaret smiled politely, the exact polished smile Savannah newspapers adored during fundraising season. "I'd only need 5 minutes with my son and his wife," she said softly, but Claire noticed another detail. Margaret never once asked how the baby was doing. Daniel returned from the hallway at the same moment, and his expression hardened immediately when he saw her. "Counsel already," he murmured quietly. "That was fast." Margaret's eyes shifted toward him without surprise. "Daniel Hayes," she said smoothly. "Still involving yourself in situations that do not concern you." Daniel crossed his arms calmly. "Attempted poisoning concerns me more than holiday etiquette." One of the attorneys stepped forward instantly. "That accusation is unsubstantiated." Claire watched the exchange silently from the hospital bed while thunder rumbled faintly outside the city skyline beyond the glass walls. Nurses slowed down, pretending not to listen, though every person on the floor clearly sensed something serious unfolding. Margaret finally turned toward Claire then, and for a moment the entire hallway seemed to go silent. "Claire," she said gently, "this misunderstanding has gone far enough." Misunderstanding, the word almost made Claire laugh, because only the Bennett family could transform poison into a public relations inconvenience. Claire slowly reached beneath the blanket and pressed a single button on the side of her watch. The hidden recorder activated instantly. Margaret continued speaking, unaware. "You are exhausted, emotional, frightened for the baby, I understand that." Claire tilted her head slightly, studying every movement, every blink, every breath. Margaret stepped closer to the glass door, lowering her voice. "But families survive difficult moments by protecting each other, not destroying each other publicly." There it was, not concern, not guilt, damage control. Daniel noticed Claire's expression change, and remained perfectly silent beside her because he knew she was letting Margaret speak intentionally. The older woman sighed softly, then delivered the sentence that changed everything. "You do not want your child growing up surrounded by scandal, Claire." Claire looked directly into her eyes through the glass divider and finally spoke. "No, Margaret," she said quietly. "But I also do not want my child growing up around people who poison his mother." The hallway froze. One nurse stopped walking entirely. Ethan suddenly emerged from the elevator at the far end of the corridor, just in time to hear the accusation, and panic flashed across his face so openly it almost looked painful. Margaret's polished smile disappeared for exactly 1 second before returning again, colder this time, more dangerous. "Be very careful what you say next," she whispered. Claire held her gaze steadily while the recorder captured every word. "No," Claire replied softly. "I think tonight you should be the careful one." The silence after Claire Bennett's words lasted only 3 seconds, but inside the maternity wing of Savannah Memorial it felt endless. Rain still tapped softly against the hospital windows. While fluorescent lights reflected off polished floors and motionless faces, Margaret Bennett stood frozen outside the glass doors of the suite, her elegant posture finally cracking beneath pressure. Ethan remained near the elevator, breathing hard, one hand gripping the back of his neck, while the two attorneys exchanged nervous glances. Beside him, Claire stayed calm in the hospital bed, because this was the exact moment federal instructors trained agents for the second powerful people realized control was slipping away. They became unpredictable. Daniel Hayes stepped forward, slowly placing himself between Margaret and the hospital room. "I think this conversation is finished," he said quietly. Margaret straightened, instantly reclaiming her polished composure with frightening speed. "You have no authority here, Daniel," she replied coldly. "And my family will not be publicly humiliated because of paranoid accusations from an unstable pregnant woman." Claire heard several nurses inhale sharply nearby, because even now, after everything, Margaret still chose reputation over remorse. Daniel's expression never changed. "Toxicology confirmed cyanogenic exposure 32 minutes ago," he said. "The hospital already notified federal authorities due to possible criminal intent involving interstate financial interests and attempted inheritance fraud." Ethan's face lost all remaining color. Inheritance fraud. Claire saw the realization hit him all at once, because Daniel had just revealed something larger than poisoning. Federal financial crimes meant investigators were no longer looking only at Thanksgiving dinner, they were looking at the Bennett empire itself. One of the attorneys stepped forward immediately. "My clients will not answer further questions without representation." Daniel nodded once. "That is your right." Then he reached into his coat pocket and removed a second flash drive smaller than the first. "Unfortunately, your clients already answered plenty before lawyers arrived." Margaret's eyes narrowed for the first time all night, and Claire knew instantly she understood something had gone catastrophically wrong. Daniel handed the drive to Dr. Monroe, who inserted it into the hospital computer monitor beside the nurse's station. Audio crackled softly through the hallway speakers, then Margaret Bennett's voice filled the corridor once again, clear, undeniable. "The family legacy cannot survive her." Several nurses stopped moving entirely. Ethan whispered, "Mother," under his breath, but the recording continued. Another voice entered, Victor Hale, calm, professional. "And if the wife survives complications," Margaret answered without hesitation, "then Ethan handles the trust transfer after the child is born." Ethan physically staggered backward against the wall like someone had knocked the air from his lungs. Claire watched him carefully, because now, for the first time, genuine fear replaced denial. Margaret turned sharply toward the computer monitor. "Turn that off immediately," she snapped, but nobody moved. The illusion surrounding the Bennett family had finally cracked, too publicly, too completely. A security officer appeared at the end of the hallway, followed by two federal investigators wearing dark jackets with identification clipped near their collars. Hospital staff stepped aside instinctively as the agents approached. Daniel folded his arms quietly. "Margaret Bennett," one investigator said calmly, "we need you to come with us regarding an active federal investigation involving conspiracy, financial coercion, and attempted homicide." The hallway exploded into overlapping voices, attorneys protesting, nurses whispering, Ethan calling for his mother, but Claire heard none of it clearly, because suddenly exhaustion crashed into her body all at once. The adrenaline keeping her upright since Thanksgiving dinner began fading, and she pressed one trembling hand protectively over her stomach beneath the blanket. Margaret slowly turned toward Claire one final time, and for the first time all night the older woman looked old, truly old, not powerful, not untouchable, just frightened. "You destroyed this family," she whispered. Claire looked at her quietly through the glass walls of the hospital suite, while red and blue emergency lights reflected faintly across the windows overlooking Savannah. "No," Claire said softly. "Your family destroyed itself the moment love became less important than control." 1 year later, the Bennett mansion stood completely dark on Thanksgiving night. The massive white columns that once glowed with warm gold light now disappeared into cold November rain, while a foreclosure notice rested quietly beside the iron front gates. Wind carried dead leaves across the empty circular driveway where luxury cars used to line up for holiday dinners and political fundraisers. The fountains had been turned off months earlier, and every window inside the estate reflected nothing Except darkness and silence. Savannah newspapers later called it the fastest collapse of a Southern dynasty in decades, but Claire Bennett never read the articles anymore. She no longer needed proof that powerful people could fall. She had watched it happen with her own eyes across town inside a small restored brick house near Forsyth Park. Soft jazz music drifted gently through a warm kitchen filled with candlelight, and the smell of roasted turkey. Claire adjusted the sleeping infant against her shoulder, while rain tapped quietly against the windows behind her. Her son Noah stirred slightly beneath the blue knitted blanket wrapped around him, then settled again with a tiny sigh. Claire smiled for the first time all evening, not the careful, controlled smile she once used around the Bennett family, but something real, something peaceful. The kitchen table was small compared to the mansion dining hall, where everything changed. Exactly 1 year earlier, no crystal chandeliers, no 20-foot mahogany table, no nervous guests pretending not to notice cruelty. There were only 3 place settings tonight, one for Claire, one for Noah's high chair, and one for Daniel Hayes, who stood near the stove quietly pouring coffee into ceramic mugs while football commentary played softly from the living room television. "You still overcooked the rolls," Daniel said dryly. Claire laughed under her breath. "And you still complain about free food?" The sound surprised her because, for years, laughter inside the Bennett estate always felt dangerous, too loud, too emotional, too human. But here in the little brick house, nobody monitored her voice, nobody watched her reactions, nobody treated kindness like weakness. Noah opened his eyes sleepily, then wrapped one tiny hand around Claire's finger, and suddenly the entire room felt still. Outside, the storm clouds slowly drifted across Savannah, while distant church bells echoed faintly through the wet streets. Daniel carried 2 coffee mugs to the table before glancing toward the sleeping child. "He has your eyes," he said quietly. Claire looked down at her son, his pale lashes resting softly against his cheeks, and felt emotion tighten unexpectedly in her chest. Noah would never remember the hospital corridors, the investigations, the whispered threats, or the fear surrounding his birth. He would grow up far away from poisoned wine and family legacies built on control. Federal investigators eventually uncovered years of financial crimes hidden beneath the Bennett empire: shell charities, offshore transfers, witness intimidation, the kind of corruption that survives only while people stay silent. Margaret Bennett accepted a plea agreement before trial. Ethan disappeared from Savannah 6 months after the investigation began and never contacted Claire again. Sometimes reporters still left messages asking for interviews, asking how it felt to survive the scandal. Claire ignored every one of them because survival was not the part she cared about anymore. Peace was the fireplace crackled softly nearby. While candlelight flickered across Noah's sleeping face, Claire reached for her coffee and noticed her